Still can't believe the first music I heard after George Davison's Pacific Memorial. Somewhere Over the Rainbow, live, by a ukulele troupe. And so George. Just when I thought that was the last goodbye, the Spirit reminded me there's hope, and that George, well, he'll always be around. Ladies and gentlemen, I offer proof of my theory through the words and stories of his friends.
Bob, tell me your favorite George story.
Favorite George story was right here at Roy with, I think, Bitch Magnet, not sure, but where George had his slideshow collection that he would project on the wall. And I can remember looking at it, and I was connecting with it because it was random, and he had also had these images that he had marked up and painted or done markers on, and I used to do the same exact thing, the slides that I'd made, and I'd never seen anybody else do that. I used to be down in LA, and there was a band that I used to do slideshows for the same way, and I looked at that and I was like, wow, that's cool. So we struck up a conversation, seen him before at a couple of other gigs, and from that point we just started talking because I heard the history he had of doing slide processing for the lab that he was with, and how he'd acquire his images, and then he'd mess around with the images and had huge carousels filled with these really great images. From that point, I had this connection with George. I really appreciated his style, his musician, you know, being a musician and also being an artist, and the man, warm as soul and great person, and I felt really lucky to get to know him and be one of George's friends. So, cheers, George. You're a good guy.
All right, here we go. All right, Steve-O.
Okay.
Let's hear the George story. Georgecore.
All right. Troy's counting me down. Oh, I thought you were counting me down. Okay, so I'm sitting at Jimmy's, Oriental Cuisine, one of the finest bars on earth, and George rolls in and sits down next to me as I'm drinking. And we have a couple drinks, and he goes like, I have to go home. I got to go home, go to bed. So I don't think anything about it. George walks out the door. 30 minutes later, George walks back in his pajamas, sits down next to me, and says, I wasn't quite spinning enough, so I need a couple more shots. Ordered 2 shots of tequila, did the shots, and then walked out with his pajamas.
George Davison.
Yeah! So one time, George and I were making out with these black chicks, and we kept rolling over on top of each other, and we had to give it up. We had to just give up making out with these black chicks. Because we kept laying on top of each other. Because we stopped because we didn't want to be on top of each other. It was cool with the girls, but it wasn't cool with me and him. So we called it a day. Half a tab of X each. And if my administrators are watching this, it's just a joke. Don't take things so seriously. A minute's a long time in this world.
Eric, George story, Georgecore.
I come down to Roy when Roy's just this side of the club. It's really small, and I come down to see George play, and he plays for probably 45 minutes, maybe plays half of 3 songs and 2/3 of another 1 or 2, and stops them and talks and starts, and I'm thinking it's great, and I'm loving it. When he finishes, him and Robin Gardner come over and tell me they're going to kick my ass if I say anything bad, and Robin Gardner says he's going to slit me, and Brent Franklin jumps up and he's like, ready to go. I'm like, sit down, Brent. And I turned to George. I'm like, can I finish my beer, or do you want to like kill me now? And he's just like, oh, finish your beer.
All right, Spencer, what's your favorite George story?
Well, first of all, let me just say that I absolutely love George. This is not as good of a story as it could be because it was sort of strange. We were all in Mel's one night, and for some reason or another, as he started to leave, he turned around, picked up a glass, and threw it against the wall and said, I just want to wake everybody up.
Mr. Luke. George Nation.
George Nation TV. So my favorite George story? There's a couple, but I'm going to go with the sappier or the one I just told to you, Scott. But every so often I throw this booze cruise where bands go out on a boat and play music on a boat, and somewhere in the midst of George's recovery, or I guess attempt at recovery, he was well enough to play on the boat and came up to me as I was setting up gear frantically and being kind of a spaz, grabbed me by the arms and said, "Dude, you have no idea what this day means to me." And then he proceeded to tell me about the health things that he'd been going through and his mom dying and whatever, and he completely changed my feeling about the day. I realized, like, pushing these cords aside and making sure that the beer line is all to the left and not floating out to the right. All that shit doesn't matter. And I don't know, he just made that day 10 times as soulful as it already was. And thank him for that. I hadn't seen him in a while, and I guess that was the last time I saw him. So that's my George story.
My testimonial? Okay. I met George through this guy right here, Max MacArthur. And my George story, I guess, would go something like this. George was sharing with me that he and Max had done acid through an eyedropper in their eye, and I said, "These guys are crazy. I love them." And that's my big George story. Sweetheart from the moment I met him. Yeah.
Georgecore, go.
Well, my story is that on the 4th of July, me and 3 friends went down to East Beach. We dropped some acid. We met some babes from Canada. We were having a great time. And at one point, we went down on the beach and we were throwing frisbee. We hadn't seen George in a month, and he's up in Santa Maria at his house. Very cool. And we're playing frisbee a minute, and then there was a wild throw that went way off, down the beach. Out of nowhere comes George. He caught the frisbee.
That is perfect. Tell us your story.
Okay, so this is my George story. So, at Max's, when I was a teenager, George said, "Come on over, I'll let you do some laundry." So I think I was like 17, and we had just played a show, I think at Giuseppe's maybe, and I had like no clothes, all right? You know the feeling. So I get over there, and George shows me, he's like, "Oh, come on in." And so what do? Stuff it, right? Because that's, and George comes out and he's like, "Dude, Scotty, what are you doing? Are you fucking kidding me?" And I was like, "Buddy, George's Chinese Laundry."
Hey, my name's Tim McGill, and I'm an old friend of George Davison's, and we started playing together at 13 years old, and it's like we couldn't go anywhere without those 2 guitars because people wouldn't let us go without them. But I got a good George story. Later on, when George was playing a lot here in Santa Barbara, living in Santa Barbara, one night we loved to walk around the town, and of course we liked being on psychedelics at the time, and so we happened to have some very good liquid from Max, and George thought it'd be a great idea to scale the flagpole at the harbor and get the harbor flag, which he did, and he put it on for a superhero cape. He wore it downtown. It just so happened that the cops saw us when we hit Haley in Lower State, and we were talking to him, but they didn't even get it. So he's like there talking to them with this stolen flag for the harbor, and we're like crying out of our minds. And he had the cops totally charmed. I mean, just typical George, man, just going on in this interesting animated conversation. I mean, just so George, and just one of the many wonderful stories of George. Thank you.
All right, Danny, what is it?
I used to hang out at the Golden Eagle Pool Hall with George and Aaron. It was always fun. George was always the life of the party. Aaron was always the head mistress of the party, and I always had a great time. George would come in later on to the Sound Factory where I worked at the record store and would regale me with all the stories of my drunken stupidness, and it was always a good time. That's all I remember. I don't remember much.
Even George! What's your name, brother?
I'm Michael Webster. In the late 80s, me and Paul had a studio in Skid Row. George used to live there in the boiler room, and he made some beautiful art in our studio and helped out in general. In return, Paul recorded this fucking awesome record for George, which was, I think, Lucky Fun Guy was the name of the record. And George was so stoked. He was like, oh, Michael, let's take Lucky Fun Guy down to Rainbow Records and make a pressing. I think he was going to make a colored pressing or whatever. And, of course, I didn't drive. George didn't drive. Nobody drove. I had this little kid at the time, and I'm like, we'll bring the kid on the bus. Little Guillermo, he's blonde, he's like yay big. So we ride the bus down to Rainbow, and we hand off the master tape. George is stoked. George is always stoked, right? He's living in the boiler room in Skid Row, but he's stoked, right? So we're on our way home, and suddenly Guillermo wakes up, right? He's been sleeping. He's like, wants his mom. This is natural. Right? I want my mom. Picture, there's me. I look kind of like this. There's George. You picture what you know what George looks like. And there's a little blonde baby. He's 1 year old, and he's crying, Mama! 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 The bus driver pulls over, and he gets out, and he's like, whose baby is this? And we both look up like, same story. And I realized, this is not going to fly. We're like, mine? But we're getting off. We had to book off the bus and call Monique to come out and pick us up.
That's amazing.
All right.
And what's your name, sir?
I'm Jim Mechanic.
Let me hear your George story.
I met George at a wonderful New Year's Eve party 2 years ago, and I guess at that point George was in remission, and just had a great conversation with him. He told me a little about his music and how he'd been around playing and really seemed to love what he does, and just always kind of, he stuck in my mind. We became Facebook friends, and then very recently I saw that he had passed, and it was really, really sad. Seemed like a great person.
Thanks, man.
All right.
Hi, Mark. Hello.
How you doing? Okay, my George story. I've known George since the 80s. We used to hang out together. We always used to see Bitch Magnet and George in the Jungle. It's just on and on and on. They opened for Jane's Addiction. And the thing that I always remember is George is always being there, and he's always, he's like air or water or alcohol. It's just like, once it's gone, then you realize how much you miss it or how much you love it. And so I remember one time when Johnny Thunders was playing at the Golden Eagle on State Street, and it was $12, which is a lot of money for the time period. It was like 89, 90, and I couldn't really afford to go in, so I sat outside, and I listened. It was really loud, so it was perfectly fine to listen to it from outside. I was sitting on a planter out on State Street, and George would come out from the show and come out to see basically how I was, because he was concerned about me, and that's just the kind of person he was. And so that's how I remember George.
Yeah.
Well, one little thing I will say about George is that when I first got to Santa Barbara, I was all of 19 years old, and I was playing in a bunch of like punk rock bands down in Orange County, like skate punk bands, and that was kind of fun. But I didn't really have any rock and roll experience, and George kind of took me under his wing, and all I really knew were bar chords, and so he spent countless hours with me in that little rehearsal studio underneath the pawn shop, whatever it was. No, wherever we rehearsed. What was that? It was like under Salvation Army or under
Peppers.
Yeah, it was under Peppers.
It was a Bitch Magnet.
Like Ugly Kid Joe and like who was that other band? Band Horse was there. What was the other?
Band called Horse.
No, it wasn't
PFK.
Horse. It was Toad.
It's like every door you open.
Toad the Wet Sprocket. Yeah. But George, all I'll have to say about George is that regardless of my youth and my immaturity and my drug habit at the time, he welcomed me in. and didn't have any judgment whatsoever, and spent hours and hours and hours. So no, that's not, you know the root of the chord, but you don't know the whole chord. So he taught me how to actually play real chords, real music. And so I guess I would have to say, I would just have to say thank you, George, for actually showing me the whole root, the whole entire chord, and spending like, I don't know, 2 years trying to show me how to play guitar. Joe went on and did a lot of things in that regard. So thank you very much, George. That's my George story.
George story.
All right. I knew George a long time ago, and we used to wander around Santa Barbara smoking pot and walk around all over the place to the Natural History Museum. And that's when he told me he was going to get into it and start a band. So I knew him before he got into the whole band thing. So, and he was a kind soul and funny, and I took him to church recently. We went to church because I come from the back up where George is. I live in Napomo and he lived in Oregon. So I took him to the far west of the big state. That's my George story.
Perfect. All right, Gina. Talk George.
Okay, so let me just tell you, George and I used to forage around in the Salvation Army as-is yard. And, you know, he would touch everything. He didn't care, germs, whatever. So he'd be in there foraging around, and one day he found a camera, a Super 8 camera, or some kind of a camera. And in those days, this was before video. And so he finds this camera and he goes, "Oh, Gina, hey, we can make movies with this." And I'm like, "What?" And he goes, "Oh, it's cheap for the film. You get 50 feet of film and, you know, we can make a movie." And so I'm like, "Really? Okay, let's do it." So we go, there's a guy, in those days you could get film, and so there was a guy you could get film from, we got black and white. So I made a number of films, all from George's inspiration. And I mean, I think I still have them, but they're not, you know, in the right, you know,
Context.
Whatever that thing is called. But anyway, and then another time, you know, Jimbo brought him over to my Jimbo, and you know, George was so close, and God, I just loved George, and Jimbo and him were so fucking, excuse my French, funny. And so they came over one day, before I knew George, and so he brings George over, and I'm like, "Who is this shaggy guy that you're bringing over?" This was in the 80s, you know, when everyone was like all clean cut, you know, chartreuse colors, and here's George all, and I'm like, "Oh my God, is this a homeless person you're bringing over to my house?" But then we sat down, we started talking, and I'm like, this guy is an artist.
Yeah. Let me hear your George story.
My first George story was I worked at Shakespeare's with Cecil, and I was 18 years old and didn't know anything about the world. And George was this larger-than-life character who was Keenan, and all of Cecil's friends just blew me away. And George was a sweetheart. And he said, "Do you want to go down and have a drink? And let's go to Mel's and have a drink." And I said, "I'm only 18. And he said, "It's okay." So we went, and it was my introduction into the world of pretty much rock and roll and alternative lifestyle, graduating out of Catholic school and seeing this whole new world, and he made it beautiful. And he was like a little kid. I love that. He was so cool. life, and we hopped down the street and went in and had our drink, and the rest is history.
Yay! Thank you. All right, this is George story.
Uh-oh. All right, so I'm Jennifer. Met George when I was 15, hanging out at Roma, and I guess, I don't even know when it was. George had this idea because he'd just gotten his food stamps in that we needed to go have a picnic at the cemetery, Santa Barbara Cemetery. So we went to the grocery store downtown and loaded up on fruit and yogurt and a whole bunch of stuff, and took the bus over to the cemetery, had it all spread out overlooking the ocean, cut all of our fruit up and sat there with our paper plates, and all of a sudden the guy in the truck, the caretaker, comes rolling up and he goes, "What are you guys doing?" George's like, "We're having a picnic." "Well, you can't have a picnic here, it's private property." George's like, "But it's beautiful, you know, we're just enjoying this." "Nope, get in the truck." So he threw us in the truck and drove us out to the front gate, and we ended up sitting on the median on the road eating our fruit salad right in front of the cemetery. So there's many little adventures like that with George. It was always very interesting. He always had these good ideas that he came up with, and so I don't know. That was about it. That's my one little George story for tonight.
Yay! It's your George story, Peter.
My George story? George, playing with the Replacements, playing Let's Go Kids. Let's Go Kids did not have words, ever. We played it a bunch of times. It was a really great song, amazing song. And we got on stage with the Replacements, and all of a sudden George had words. And it was really cool until George left the stage and left me and Craig out there, but George was the most spontaneous and amazing musician I ever played with. He would surprise you pretty much every time you showed up to play with him, and that's my favorite thing about George and why I love playing with him. And I wish he was still here, because god damn it, I would love to do a George and Jennifer reunion. George Davison, I love you. I miss you, and I will only miss you more and more and more as days go by. Peace.